A shy girl undergoes hemorrhoid surgery. Shockingly, her doctor is a young millionaire and falls madly in love with her. Ivy Reynolds stood at the front desk of the clinic, clutching the hem of her cardigan so tightly her knuckles were white. Her throat felt tight, her chest constricted. The air in the waiting room was sterile, cool, but her palms were sweating. "Miss Reynolds?" the nurse called, clipboard in hand. She looked up with wide eyes, barely managing a nod. She stood and followed, her gaze fixed on the floor, avoiding the eyes of the other patients, as if they could see right through her, see the shame, the humiliation that clung to her like a second skin. They reached the intake room. The nurse smiled kindly, but her voice was brisk, practiced. "All right, we'll just go over a few details before the doctor sees you. This is your first time here?" Ivy nodded. "Any prior rectal surgeries?" Ivy froze. Her heart pounded. Her face turned scarlet. Her voice caught in her throat. She swallowed hard. I just want to disappear." The nurse hesitated, her expression softening. "It's okay. We just need to know so the doctor can take care of you properly." Ivy nodded again, more mechanically this time. She had never wanted to be anywhere less than she did at that moment. The nurse left the room after checking a few boxes on the form. Ivy sat there on the examination table, her hands fidgeting in her lap, her legs crossed tightly, as if she could shield herself from what was coming. She told herself it wouldn't be that bad, that the doctor would be old, maybe aloof, and would keep everything professional and clinical, that she could get through it if she didn't have to look him in the eye. The door opened, and her breath stopped. A tall man in his early 30s stepped in, wearing navy scrubs and a white coat. His hair was dark and slightly tousled, and his eyes clear, attentive, too kind. Met hers instantly. "Good morning, Miss Reynolds," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Harrington." She didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind screamed, "No, no, 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 not him, anyone but him." This wasn't the elderly doctor she had imagined. He wasn't distant or clinical or distracted. He was devastatingly handsome, and that made it worse. She felt her stomach twist in panic. Her throat tightened. He took a small step back, noticing her frozen posture. "It's okay," he said gently. "We don't have to rush anything. I just want to talk for a bit and make sure you're comfortable before we proceed." Comfortable? The word hit her like a cruel joke. She was about to bear the most humiliating part of herself to a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine. I think I should go," she said quickly, her voice cracking. She started to stand, but his voice stopped her. "Ivy," he said, soft but firm. She looked at him in surprise. He'd said her name like it mattered, like she mattered. "I read the note you attached to your intake form," he said, "the part where you asked not to be laughed at." Her cheeks burned. "I'm not here to judge you," he continued. "I'm here to help you feel better, that's all, and if you'd rather have someone else. Female doctor, nurse practitioner. I can arrange that, no questions asked." Ivy hesitated. Part of her wanted to run, to escape and never return, but another part, a quiet, tired part, longed for this to be over, for the pain to stop, for someone to treat her like she wasn't disgusting. She lowered herself back onto the table, her fingers gripping the edge. "Just don't look at me like I'm broken," she whispered. Lucas Harrington pulled a stool closer and sat at her eye level. "I won't," he said, "because you're not." Her heart was still pounding, but something inside her shifted. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her, not through her, not past her, not down on her, but at her. And she wasn't sure why, but that made her stay. Long before Ivy Reynolds ever sat on a clinic examination table, she had learned to sit with pain. Not just physical, but the deep, persistent ache of shame, of isolation, of never feeling like she belonged. It had started in middle school, the whispers, the laughter behind cupped hands, the cruel names muttered in the hallways. She didn't walk like the other girls. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sometimes she winced when she bent down or moved too quickly. By 8th grade, someone had spread a rumor that she had butt problems, and that was all it took. No one wanted to sit next to her at lunch. No one invited her to birthday parties. She became the invisible girl who always wore long sweaters, who asked to use the restroom too often, who kept her head down and her voice even lower. Her mother, a kind but overworked woman who juggled 2 jobs, tried to be there for her, but Ivy never found the words to explain what was wrong. How could she tell her mother that something inside her felt permanently broken? By 16, Ivy stopped wearing dresses, stopped going to gym class, stopped dreaming about sleepovers or first kisses or summer swims. She found refuge in the corners of the school library, in the company of dusty books and the comforting silence of unread pages. When her mother died unexpectedly of a brain aneurysm, Ivy was 17. She didn't cry at the funeral, not because she didn't feel the loss, but because by then, she'd already learned how to live with a kind of numbness that blanketed everything. She moved in with her grandmother, a sweet, soft-spoken woman in her 80s who made tea every afternoon and let Ivy be as quiet as she wanted. It was the safest Ivy had felt in years, but safety, she knew, was not the same as connection. Books became her only constant. She read everything, from classic literature to medical journals. She could name every muscle in the human body but couldn't hold eye contact with a stranger for more than a second. After graduating with a degree in library sciences, she took a job at a small public library tucked between a laundromat and a coffee shop. She worked morning shifts, labeled returned books, and spent lunch breaks reading in the supply closet. She loved the solitude. And yet, the pain never stopped. It pulsed in her lower back, radiated through her hips, flared every time she sat too long. At night, she lay on her side in the dark, clutching a heating pad and whispering to herself. One more day, just one more day. She Googled symptoms, read medical forums, downloaded ebooks on alternative healing, but she never made an appointment. The idea of telling someone, of being seen, was worse than the pain itself. Until, finally, it became unbearable, and she realized that her biggest fear wasn't humiliation. It was the possibility that she might never know what it felt like to live without this weight. That she would grow old carrying a pain no one ever saw. So she wrote a letter. A short, trembling note attached to her online intake form. It read, "I'm not looking for sympathy. I just ask, please, don't laugh when you look at me." It was the bravest thing she had ever written. The day of her appointment, Ivy almost canceled 3 times. She told herself it was a mistake, that she could survive this on her own, but something inside her, some small, persistent ember, held on. Because Ivy didn't want a perfect life. She didn't want fairy tale romance or grand adventure. She just wanted to sit in a chair, in a public place, and not feel like her body was betraying her. To laugh without fear of pain, to go to the movies without silently counting the minutes until the credits rolled so she could finally stand. Her dream was simple. One day, she whispered into her pillow the night before the appointment, just one day where I can sit as long as I want and not hurt. She never imagined that this quiet, broken wish would be the beginning of everything. Lucas Harrington never wanted to be a millionaire. He simply was one, by birth, not by choice. His family owned one of the most prestigious private hospital groups on the East Coast. His father, a decorated heart surgeon and business magnate, had expected him to follow in his footsteps, not just in medicine, but in prestige, expansion, and legacy. Lucas, however, had different plans. At 22, he graduated summa cum laude from Harvard. At 26, he finished his residency with high honors and multiple fellowship offers from institutions across the country. He could have picked any glamorous specialty, cardiology, neurosurgery, even plastic surgery, and been set for life. But instead, he chose colorectal surgery. People scoffed. Even his father asked bluntly, "Why would you waste your potential on that part of the body?" Lucas didn't answer right away. He never did when it came to his mother. She had been the quiet force in his life, soft-spoken, bookish, the kind of woman who brought flowers to nurses and remembered janitors' birthdays. When she started showing signs of illness, fatigue, unexplained bleeding, stomach pain, she'd said nothing, not even to Lucas, who had already been in med school. "I was just embarrassed," she had whispered from her hospital bed. "I thought it would pass. I didn't want anyone looking at me like I was broken." By the time she was diagnosed with stage 4 colorectal cancer, it was too late. She died within the year. Lucas never forgot that. The shame, the silence, the unbearable truth that someone he loved had suffered in secret because the world had made her feel like her body was something to be ashamed of. So he chose to be the doctor she never had. At 31, Lucas was known not just for his skill but for his approach. He wore simple scrubs instead of tailored suits, drove a modest car. He had turned down interviews, awards, and opportunities that would have made him a celebrity surgeon. Instead, he built trust with his patients. Quietly, consistently, he learned their names, remembered their pets, asked about their kids, because to him, healing started the moment someone felt safe enough to say, "This hurts." The day Ivy Reynolds' chart landed on his desk, it was supposed to be a routine pre-op file. He scanned the details as he sipped his coffee. Female, 26, external hemorrhoids, chronic discomfort, previous conservative treatments, ineffective. He nearly flipped to the next page, until a handwritten note tucked inside caught his eye. It wasn't a formal letter, it wasn't signed. It simply said, "I'm not looking for sympathy, I just ask, please, don't laugh when you look at me." Lucas stared at the words for a long moment. Something about the handwriting, slightly shaky but determined, hit him in the chest. He thought of his mother, of the way her hands had trembled when she finally confessed her pain, of the look in her eyes, begging him to still see her as whole. He closed the file slowly. This wasn't just a surgery. This was a girl trying to be brave in a world that hadn't made room for her courage. When he walked into the exam room and saw Ivy, her face pale with dread, he recognized something instantly. Not in her physical form, but in the way she gripped the edge of the table, the way her eyes darted away from his. Shame, raw and human. He spoke gently, sat at eye level, gave her space, and when she whispered, "Don't look at me like I'm broken," he didn't flinch. He just said, "I won't." Because you're not. It wasn't a rehearsed line. It wasn't part of some polished bedside manner. It was the truth. Lucas didn't know then why this girl had moved something in him. He had treated thousands of patients. He had seen suffering and strength in all forms. But there was something about Ivy, the way she came in despite her fear, the way she tried to disappear but still handed him a note, that made her unforgettable. And as he closed the door behind him that day, he realized something else. He didn't want to forget her, not just because of her pain, but because of the quiet way she had chosen to face it. The day of the surgery came faster than Ivy had expected. She hadn't slept the night before. Her stomach twisted with nerves, not from fear of the procedure itself, but from everything it represented: exposure, vulnerability, the unbearable intimacy of being seen in a place she had spent years trying to hide. At check-in, she could barely meet the receptionist's eyes. Her hands trembled as she signed the consent forms. Every step through the hallway felt like she was walking into a spotlight. Then a nurse appeared, smiling kindly. "Dr. Harrington would like to see you in his private consultation room before we begin." Ivy hesitated. "Is something wrong?" "No, not at all. He just prefers to speak with certain patients personally, especially for sensitive procedures like this." She followed in silence, her heart pounding. The room was warm, quiet, with soft lighting and no medical equipment in sight. It didn't feel like a part of the hospital. It felt safe. Lucas stood by the window, his white coat off, wearing only scrubs. He turned when she entered, and his expression was softer than she remembered. Not clinical, not concerned, just present. "Hi, Ivy," he said gently. "Thank you for coming in early." She nodded but didn't speak. "I know this isn't easy," he continued, "so I wanted to talk with you first, not as your surgeon, but as someone who understands what it means to be scared." She sat slowly, gripping the arms of the chair like she was bracing for impact. "I don't want to be dramatic," she murmured, "but this feels like the hardest thing I've ever done." Lucas smiled slightly. "It's not dramatic, it's brave." They sat in silence for a moment before she looked up, her voice barely audible. "Have you ever laughed at a patient?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at her seriously, then slowly shook his head. "I've laughed with patients. With my mom, actually, when she got through a particularly hard treatment and insisted on dancing in the hospital hallway." He paused. "But I've never laughed at someone's pain, especially not when they're doing the hardest thing a person can do. Face it." Ivy blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. Lucas leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "You asked me once not to look at you like you're broken. I didn't, and I won't, because you're not. You're just human. And right now, being human is hard." For a moment, something loosened in her chest. "You really don't think it's disgusting?" she asked. "No," he said softly. "I think it's human. And I think hiding what hurts us, just because the world makes us feel ashamed, is a tragedy." She looked at him, searching his face for even a flicker of pity. There was none, only understanding. And in that quiet room, for the first time in a long time, Ivy didn't feel like a problem to be solved. She felt seen. Lucas stood and offered his hand. "We'll take good care of you, and when you wake up, this part will be behind you." She looked at his hand for a moment, then placed hers in it. It was the smallest gesture, but to her, it felt like crossing a chasm. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. She nodded. "I'm ready." As they walked toward the OR, Ivy's heart still raced, but not from panic. It was the strange, unfamiliar beat of hope. The recovery process wasn't glamorous. There were good days, and there were days Ivy didn't want to get out of bed. Days when the pain was less physical and more emotional. Echoes of old fears resurfacing, whispering that she still wasn't enough. But each follow-up visit to the clinic slowly chipped away at those doubts. Lucas always greeted her with the same calm presence, never rushed, never clinical. His warmth was subtle, but it seeped into the sterile room like sunlight through a drawn curtain. At her third follow-up appointment, after checking her healing progress and adjusting some of her care instructions, he looked up from the chart with a small smile. "So, are you still reading Little Women every night?" Ivy's lips parted in confusion. How did you know I read that?" Lucas blinked, then tilted his head. "You mentioned it the day of your first consultation. You said Joe March reminded you to be brave, even when it's hard." It stuck with me. She stared at him, stunned into silence. She barely remembered saying it. It had been a throwaway comment, uttered between nervous breaths while adjusting the sleeves of her cardigan, and yet he'd remembered. No one ever remembered things like that, not about her. Ivy suddenly found it hard to swallow. The moment sat heavy in her chest, not uncomfortable but unfamiliar, like being noticed for the first time in a way that didn't make her want to disappear. Lucas stood to wash his hands, glancing at her through the mirror. "She's your favorite character, right?" Ivy nodded slowly. "She always felt like the girl who wanted more but was afraid of wanting too much," she said. That resonated. Lucas smiled faintly, turning back to her. "You don't seem afraid now." "I am," she said softly, "but I don't want to be anymore." After the appointment, she lingered in the hallway longer than she meant to. He walked her out as usual and held the door just a moment longer than necessary. As she stepped outside into the crisp air, Ivy felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. She began to look forward to her visits, not for the medical updates, but for the conversation, for the small kindnesses, how he remembered her tea preference, how he never interrupted her when she spoke, how he asked how she was and waited, really waited, for the answer. During one visit, Lucas noticed a worn paper bag peeking out of her tote bag. "New book?" he asked. "Old favorite," she said, blushing. "I reread books a lot. They're safe. They don't change on you." Lucas considered that. "I think people can be like that too," he said, "if you let them." That night, Ivy found herself writing in her journal for the first time in years. Not about pain, not about shame, but about possibility. She wrote, "He listens, not because he has to, but because he wants to. And I don't know what to do with that kind of attention." Lucas, too, felt something shifting. With Ivy, he didn't feel the weight of expectations. She didn't care about his last name, his resume, his fortune. In fact, she barely asked about his life at all. But when she did, it wasn't to admire, it was to understand. One afternoon, as they wrapped up another check-in, Ivy asked him, "Why this field? You could have been anything." Lucas paused, then answered honestly, "Because people ignore their pain when it's embarrassing, and I wanted to be someone they could trust not to turn away." He didn't say it for effect. He didn't even meet her eyes when he said it. But Ivy looked at him differently after that, not as a doctor, not as a man, but as someone who had chosen to see what the world often overlooked. And maybe that was what made her feel safe, because for the first time in her life, Ivy wasn't invisible. She was seen. The clinic room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the gentle scribble of Lucas's pen across Ivy's chart. It was a routine follow-up, her sixth by now. The air between them had grown more familiar, less clinical. She no longer clenched her fists or avoided his eyes, and Lucas, he no longer looked at her like a patient. That day, while he stepped out briefly to check on a scan, Ivy's gaze wandered around the room. She'd never really looked before, not because she wasn't curious, but because being in a medical space had always made her retreat inward. But now, her eyes caught a photo on the bookshelf. It was framed simply, sitting beside a worn copy of The Art of Compassionate Care. In the photo, a younger Lucas stood with his arm wrapped around a woman, elegant, warm-eyed, with a scarf wrapped around her head. She was smiling, but there was a fatigue in her face Ivy recognized too well. When Lucas returned, he followed her line of sight and smiled gently. "That's my mom," he said, walking over. Her name was Eleanor. "She's beautiful," Ivy said softly. "She was," Lucas nodded, "and strong. So strong." Ivy hesitated, then asked, "Was she sick?" Lucas didn't speak for a moment. Then, with the kind of quiet honesty he always seemed to carry, he said, "She had colorectal cancer. Stage 4 by the time we found it." Ivy's eyes widened. I'm so sorry." "She hid it," he continued, "for months, maybe longer. She thought the symptoms were just stress, or aging, or too embarrassing to talk about." He sat down beside her, his voice lower now. She kept brushing it off, even when the pain started, even when she couldn't sit through a full dinner. Ivy's throat tightened. "She didn't want anyone to look at her like she was weak," he said. "Especially not me. And when she finally did go to the doctor, it was too late." Ivy didn't realize tears were welling in her eyes until one slipped down her cheek. She wiped it quickly, murmuring, "I'm sorry, that's so unfair." Lucas nodded. "Yeah, it is." There was a long pause filled with the kind of silence that isn't empty, but heavy with the weight of shared understanding. "I used to think the same thing," Ivy whispered. "That if I just ignored it long enough, if I hid it well enough, maybe it would go away. Maybe I would go away." Her voice broke on the last words, and Lucas turned to face her fully. "But you didn't," he said gently. "You stayed. You showed up. That matters." Ivy looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "She was scared," she said. "Just like me." "Yes," Lucas said. "But you did something she never got the chance to. You asked for help even when it terrified you." Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them was a doctor or a patient. They were just two people who had loved and lost and learned to live in the aftermath of fear. Lucas reached for a tissue and handed it to her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. He didn't respond right away. He just sat with her, letting the quiet be a balm rather than a burden. Then he said softly, "I think she would have liked you." Ivy smiled through her tears. "I think I would have liked her too." They sat like that for a while, no need for more words, because somehow in their pain they had found the same language, and it spoke of healing, not just of the body, but of the heart. It had taken Lucas weeks to write the letter, not because he didn't know what to say, but because every time he tried, he found himself walking the tightrope between his duty and his heart, between professionalism and something far more personal, more dangerous, more real. Ivy had made incredible progress. Her recovery was nearly complete. Her confidence, once buried under layers of shame, now peeked through in the smallest but most beautiful ways, like how she no longer looked at the floor when she spoke, or how she sometimes let her smile linger just a second longer than before. But Lucas knew the boundary was there, and he could no longer pretend it hadn't blurred, so he stepped back. He reassigned her post-op care to another physician, leaving a note with the front desk and a sealed envelope addressed to Ivy. Inside, on a single sheet of paper, he'd written, "Ivy, you are no longer my patient, which is the only reason I'm writing this, because I didn't want my care for you to ever be confused with duty or ethics or the Hippocratic Oath. What I feel has nothing to do with my title or yours. The truth is, I don't want to heal you anymore. I just want to be near you, not because you need me, but because I need you. If you feel the same, if there's even the smallest part of you that wants to be seen not as a patient but as a person, I'll be here. No lab coats, no charts, just me." Lucas, when Ivy read the letter, she sat motionless for 10 full minutes. Then, slowly, she folded it in half and tucked it into her coat pocket like a secret too fragile for the world to see. That evening, after the library closed, she walked to the clinic. The lights were dimmed, the lobby quiet. She took the elevator up to the rooftop garden, Lucas's favorite place, where he often went to clear his mind. A small sanctuary above the noise of the city. When she stepped onto the rooftop, she found him there, watering a small bed of herbs near the railing, back turned, unaware. Her voice was shaky, but steady enough to reach him. "I got your letter." He paused, set down the watering can, but didn't turn around. "I didn't expect you to come," he said quietly. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I'm still figuring things out." Now he turned. Their eyes met in the soft glow of string lights that lined the rooftop walls. "I'm not perfect," she said. "I still flinch when people look too long. I still forget how to breathe when I get overwhelmed." She took a small step forward. "But if you still want to read books with me, if you still want to sit with me on bad days and not say anything, I think I'm done running." Lucas didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stepped forward and gently took her hand in his, fingers warm, grounding. Then he held it like something precious, like something hard-won. "I've been waiting for you," he said. She smiled, shy, hopeful, new, and in that moment surrounded by the scent of basil and rosemary, beneath a sky that finally felt open and kind, they stopped being doctor and patient and started being two people choosing to stay. 1 year later, the library inside the Rosewood Community Center didn't look like much at first glance. Just a cozy corner with mismatched armchairs, shelves of gently used books, and soft yellow light that glowed like a warm hug. But to those who visited often, it was known as something more. The healing shelf. It had been Ivy's idea. After everything, she didn't want a grand gesture or a fancy job. She wanted a space where people like her, quiet souls with unseen bruises, could sit, read, breathe, and remember that they weren't broken. Lucas had funded the renovation without hesitation, not because he wanted his name on a plaque, but because he believed in her vision. He believed in her, and more importantly, he believed in them. They still had hard days. Ivy still flinched at loud voices or sudden attention. Lucas still carried the ache of loss when he thought of his mother. But they'd learned to hold space for each other's wounds. They didn't call it a fairy tale love. They called it an honest one. Most mornings, Ivy would arrive early to arrange the books by theme: grief, hope, beginnings. And Lucas would swing by between patients, bringing her coffee and sitting beside her as she labeled new arrivals. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they just sat. It was enough. On the anniversary of the Healing Shell's opening, the community center held a small event, a mental health and resilience seminar, open to anyone who needed it. The final speaker was Ivy. She stood behind the podium in a soft floral blouse, her hands trembling only slightly. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes clear. In the front row, Lucas sat with his arms resting on his knees, his gaze steady. Ivy took a breath. "When I was younger, I thought healing meant never hurting again. That if I was brave enough, or good enough, or invisible enough, maybe the pain would go away. She looked at the audience, faces of strangers, friends, survivors. But I was wrong. Healing isn't about pretending you're not wounded. It's about being seen, even when you're still bleeding. It's about letting someone sit with you, not to fix you, but to remind you that you're not alone. Her voice softened. There was a time I would have run from a stage like this, from people like you, from myself. A pause. But someone didn't let me. She glanced toward Lucas, her eyes gentle. He didn't rescue me. He didn't sweep in and make it all go away. What he did was harder, she swallowed. He stayed. When I was hurting, when I was scared, when I didn't know if I was worth staying for. Her voice cracked slightly, but she kept going. And because of that, I learned to love the parts of me I used to hide, the ones I thought made me too much or not enough. A quiet hush fell over the room, the kind born not from silence, but from listening. She smiled. And now, I get to help others do the same. One book, one story, one quiet afternoon at a time. The audience applauded, some standing, others wiping their eyes. Ivy stepped down, cheeks flushed, heart pounding in a way that felt alive. Lucas met her near the back of the room. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her the way he always had, from the very beginning, like she was someone worth seeing. "You are amazing," he said quietly. "I almost fainted." "But you didn't," she laughed softly. He reached for her hand. "You used to hide from the light," he said. "Now you are the light, for so many people." She looked up at him, eyes shimmering. "I think you were the first one who ever saw me in it." He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "You helped me see it too." They stood there a moment longer, hands linked, surrounded by the gentle hum of people reconnecting with themselves. And in that moment, they weren't perfect, but they were whole. Because love, they had learned, wasn't about fixing each other. It was about choosing each other. Over and over again, even on the hard days, especially on the hard days. And finally, after years of hiding in shadows, they no longer feared being seen. They had each other, and that was enough. Sometimes, love doesn't arrive in grand gestures. It arrives in silence, in stillness, in the soft miracle of being truly seen. Ivy didn't need to be rescued. She needed someone who would stay when she was hurting, when she was healing, and when she was learning to love herself again. And Lucas, he didn't fall for a perfect woman. He fell for her courage, for the quiet way she showed up for her own life. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, and that's what made it beautiful. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories, where we share true, tender stories that remind us what it means to be human. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment that might just change the way you see love, life, and yourself. Thank you for watching. And remember, you don't have to be perfect to be loved. You just have to be seen.